Um, so basically, this is just my boathouse. I set it up to be really bare right now, so it's just like the site that I think it was the first site we visited in Minneapolis along the river. So I'm just gonna go over basically like terrain tools, texturing the terrain, placing trees and tree clusters and stuff like that, and then texturing the building and placing lighting, and other things in there. So I guess I'll start with the tools for the terrain. So at the site, basically everything, the only thing I need to design is what I'm going to be able to see in my final rendering. So I already have basically the background done behind the building, but if I wanted to take pictures from inside, like facing up this way, I want to have like the river and the other side of the river, I guess, on the other, like visible over there. So in the bottom left, you go to landscape and you have your height tools up in the top right corner of the little panel. And it's pretty simple. You have a raise tool, lowering tool, a tool that flattens everything to a specific height you want, smoothing, and the jitter tool, which just kind of randomizes the terrain as you click on it, which I don't really use ever. And then your brush size, which obviously adjusts the brush as you can see, and the brush speed, which adjusts how quickly your tool works. The brush speed can get pretty fast, really exponentially, so I like to keep it pretty low usually, but I guess I'll just start by using the lowering tool to create a spot for the river first, and then I'll actually put in the water for it. I think one big thing that people miss sometimes is that, or that I guess they don't grasp the scale of how large like a mountain or a river would actually be. Like I remember last year when I did the Cripple Creek stuff for the dwelling, I started developing a terrain for like Cripple Creek and doing the mountains around it, and they're just huge, but they kind of had to be to make it look realistic whatsoever. So basically, since this is going to be covered with water, I don't really need to do anything besides lower it a little bit. And then the other side, since it's going to be so far away, I don't need to do much besides raise that a bit because it's going to be really low detail. So I can just do that really easily, but I want to match the height of this side kind of. Typically, I don't like to work from a side either like this in the view. I prefer to work from above because if I'm working from above, when I'm using the tool and brushing, it doesn't like get stuck in a spot. Whereas if I was way down close and looking at the side and I wanted to get like a nice mass from all the way over here to here, I'll get stuck painting the front and I can't really get that back spot that well. Like you can see the top just starts growing a bunch, or the front of it, I mean. So yeah, I prefer to work from the top view. So I guess I'll just paint in enough of a terrain so that I can take pictures of it nicely, I suppose. Okay, should be plenty. So I have a riverbed, but no river now. I know some people like to use just like the water tool where you can click and drag this out to be your water, and then you can adjust the height of it as much as you want. But I don't like that personally because then you can see at the edge of it, the water just kind of clips off and there's no like foamy edge or anything. So what I prefer to do is instead of using the water, I use the ocean tool, and you just use that by turning it on, and then you can see it fills it out and it looks a lot more natural at the edges. And you can edit this one as well so that it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't need to look like this crazy, like the ocean necessarily, because we're working with a river instead. So I just work with it. I kind of play with the settings to figure it out. Wave intensity is kind of as it sounds, so I'm going to lower that a bit because we're not in the ocean. Turbidity, I think, is just how, like, you can see when I adjust that, like, it's how thick it kind of looks, the water does. So I like to turn that down so you can kind of see the ground underneath it. Then wind direction obviously just pushes which direction the flow is going to be going of the water. So try and get that right. Then speed, obviously. The height is a big one though, because that's where it's gonna lie. So for this, probably right about where it started at default. And then to get like really close subtle adjustments, you can hold shift. And then it makes it a little easier to get a little more specifics with where you're drawing it. And then color preset, that's just like adjusting that, I think it just changes the color for you. I've never really used that. Personally, I just assign the color. And for this, I'd do probably something a little more brown and then increase the brightness because that kind of helps the color come through a little more. And then it's not so like this dark blue up close. There, that'll do. So now I have the river and decent enough land masses that I can get pictures of and hide like the rest or Photoshop it out if I need to. I might edit the terrain over there on that side a little bit and even it out. So you just use go back to nature, or landscape, excuse me, work in the height map, and then raise this again. And then the flatten tool, that one's kind of tricky. When I first started using it, it confused me because I would like be moving my mouse really quickly, and you can see it stops flattening it to the height I want when I go over to the river too fast. Because you need to, the way it works is it like flattens basically to what over 50% of your brush is highlighted over. So you kind of have to work with it slowly and with a intense brush speed. That way it'll actually kind of make everything an even height for you. So I'll do that just to make sure that everything's a little more even over here and I don't have huge gaps, because I know the other side of the shore in Minneapolis, I mean, it was just neighborhoods and stuff, so it was relatively flat, excuse me. Don't mean to call it Minneapolis fat, that's rude. And then since it comes out with these cliffs and stuff like that, I don't need that, or I don't want that really, so I'll just use the smooth tool. And that does basically what the name says, it just smooths it out a little bit, makes it look less like a mountainside, because that's not what we have down here in Minnesota. Okay, that should be good enough now. So I have all the terrain and everything, but we all went there and we know it's not like all pretty green grass across the entire ground. So what you can do to change that is with the paint tool under your landscape tools. I always like to use, it's the same brush tools kind of, but with the added tile size, which is like how large the texture map is going to be that you paint. So what I do before I start painting everything is I like to put down like a swatch of every single texture that I'm going to use, because there are different texture templates you can choose from by clicking on this little choose landscape icon. And so what I want to use usually, I typically go for this middle one here, because that's just the region we're in. It matches, I think, the best, because it has, I think, like this leafy texture, kind of a marshy texture, and then kind of an in-between like half-grown grass with like a couple of leaves on it. And I'm pretty sure this is what I used originally in my boathouse renderings as well. So I like to go with that. And then you can change the side rock as well. You can turn it off if you want, but I like to keep it on just because it kind of looks a little realistic. But I always edit the type, and I find you can choose like gravel if you want, where it looks like that, or any of these really. You can even do farmland, I guess, which is kind of goofy, but I think I'll just go with the Europe side rock, because that's what I usually do. So the first thing that I do with the textures then is get rid of the swatches, because I don't need them anymore now that I know that what I'm going to be using. So just paint over these. But then I like to use the marshy texture to cover the bottom of the riverbed, because you can just really subtly see the color change, and it looks a little bit different when it comes up to the shore then. So I'll use this green marshy one, increase my brush size to get most of the river, and then just start painting. And it's kind of just a rough thing at first. Like, obviously I don't want to leave it so that I have that harsh change between nice grass and like the marsh texture there. But I'll get around to changing that after this. I just want to get a nice bed down for the texture. I suppose I've noticed when I've worked with other people, I should mention how I'm moving around so quickly. Lumion doesn't have like a controls list, I don't think. So it's just W, A, S, and D to like move around, but it's super slow, as you can see, because that's all I'm using right now. I'm not even sure if you can see that I'm moving. If you hold shift while you do those, you move a little bit quicker. And if you're working at large scale with terrain like this, if you hold shift and space at the same time, you can absolutely zoom all over the place. You're a speed racer. So yeah, just if you ever need to move around rather than having to zoom with your mouse and stuff, and it's just a little bit easier, I think. Okay, so with this texture here on the edge, what I do to get rid of it and kind of blend it a little better is I go back to the original grass texture and I keep the brush kind of small, but then I lower the brush speed a ton and I just kind of click over it until it starts to fade and get a little more gradual of a transition between the two textures. And it just looks a little nicer than that way, a little more natural. But I don't need to do this everywhere, because obviously, like I said at the beginning of this, you're really only creating a landscape for renderings that you know you're going to be able to see parts of. So like I'm going to be taking pictures probably from here at the end of it, maybe some facing out this way, whoops, like through these windows and glass. So it's not going to be super noticeable over here that this texture is really abrasive, especially because I'm going to end up covering this in trees anyway. So what I really want to focus on with texturing is just going to be mostly this main area that's close to the building that's going to be visible. So I'll just cover this up over here a little bit and maybe just over here. And that is totally fine for the marsh then. So another thing that the site had, I remember, was it had kind of like gravelly paths. And I don't necessarily have a gravel texture in this, but I've got the kind of dirty one that I used with just a couple of leaves on it. So I like to paint that around the sides of the building, kind of to imply that, you know, the grass stops around there because it doesn't grow quite as well next to the structure. And I'll do the exact same thing as I did with the river, where I kind of paint a nice solid surface underneath it, and then I go up to the edges of it and just kind of brush those away slowly to get a more gradual transition. So I'll do that around the building, and then I think there are docks like roughly here and here. I had them in my model originally, but when I opened this back up, they weren't there anymore, so I don't know what happened to them, but I'll just pretend they're there and draw paths out to them just so I can work with the textures a little more. Okay. And then again, it's just a matter of like kind of blending that in a little bit with your main grass stroke. So just clicking over that, making it look more faded. And then if I go a little too quickly, I can just lower the brush speed a little bit and go back in with the other texture and just put it back where it needs to go. And then I remember there was like this path that came down the side of the hill here that I'll add, just subtly coming in, increase my brush speed a bit. And a lot of times when I do these, like when I'm actually working on one of my own projects, I won't just do it based off memory, obviously. Like it's really great to have, I have two monitors, which is a luxury, but I like to have Google Earth or Maps open on my second monitor so I can look at that and use that as reference for what I'm going to be doing as a landscape around it. Like for my most recent, or for the culture center we just did, I had Google Maps open like the entire time, just so I could get the details in my photoshopping and stuff down to like the street lines that were going to be in front of the building and stuff, just to add that layer of realism to it. So I'll just finish up this path here, and then that's probably good for the paths. So then the only other thing that the place is missing in texture is maybe a little bit of this leafy texture, considering this whole place is surrounded by like pine trees and broadleaf trees. So there's definitely leaves just lying on the ground and stuff because it's pretty shady. My only problem with this though is that texture is massive. Those leaves aren't going to be that big. So this is where that tile size comes in. So you can just bring that way down to something that's a lot more realistic, probably right about there. The only thing that's kind of a bummer is that you can kind of, I don't know if you can notice it, but at least I can. There's like that kind of a repeating texture going through it. That's really obvious. So it's kind of nice to be able to hide that with foliage later on. But for now, I just like to blend that in by just placing it and doing the same thing that I was doing with the river and the paths by just kind of clicking over it and getting smoother texture transitions. So increase my brush speed. Whoops. Cool. And then I'll blend that in a bit. And I might blend it, since this one's so similar to that path one, it's kind of nice to try and blend it with that one as well. It's just a little more subtle then. And then just adding grass over that. So it looks kind of really patchy when you're done with it, but when you come out in your renderings, it does make a difference to see kind of just a little bit of variability in the surface, so it's not just all green. It looks a little more realistic, in my opinion, to have like just little variables in the grass texture, because I mean, at least I know in my backyard at home, we have dogs, and where they like to do their business, the grass is not the same. So it just adds a layer of realism. So that's probably good for this. Does anyone have any questions on terrain mapping, texturing, or water anything before I move on. Does anyone have any questions on terrain mapping, texturing,